Tonight, we bring you a story of love, loss, and murder. It's the story of Jamie Carney, an American leftist who spent time in Europe participating in anti-ICE, pro-Palestine protests. This 43-year-old mother met a guy. He was a Muslim migrant, and he wanted her to move abroad with him. I want to pause right here because I'm not for a moment suggesting that it's easy for a 43-year-old single mom to find love. From what I hear, the dating pool out there is pretty rough if you're a leftist activist looking for a man who shares politics and won't hurt you. But should you have to run off with this guy? Is the dating pool that bad? Like, the new social media trend I've seen indicates that women are having to lower their standards. Now, tragically, Jamie Carney has been found dead, beaten to death by who knows, but her boyfriend appears to be the prime suspect. Investigators believe he fled from Dublin to Istanbul before Carney's body was discovered, as so many loving boyfriends do. Authorities are working with Interpol now to locate him. Joining us now with reaction, co-founder of Europa.com and author of Ethnopolitics, Nationalism, Identity, and the Future of the West, Keith Woods. Keith, what is your reaction to this terrible murder of Jamie Carney?
Well, it's tragic, but of course we've become used to tragedies like this. I've lost count of in the last few years how many high-profile migrant crimes there have been in Ireland. There was a particularly high-profile case of a Middle Eastern migrant who beheaded two gay men in the west of Ireland. Just recently, actually, just last week, we had the trial of Riyad Bouchakr, who was an Algerian migrant who, in a fit of rage, stabbed three children and their carer outside a school in central Dublin, which sparked those huge riots we saw a couple of years ago in Dublin. And in his case, I mean, he actually, prior to the attack, this came out recently in the trial, he was saying effing Irish, and this was sparked by a social welfare refusal letter, right? This was a guy who'd been in the country 20 years, had contributed nothing, and apparently had a racial revenge fantasy against the Irish people over his lack of welfare. So these are the kinds of people that are being accepted into the country. Now, despite that, and despite how tragically common these horror stories are becoming, there's a uniform response from the establishment politicians, establishment media, which is that the real problem is Irish people's misogyny. This is what should be discussed, right? A socialist politician, Ruth Coppinger, stood up in our parliament today and said this is a sign that we need to tackle misogyny and we need to censor social media more, right? Of course, that would be the answer. But no, this was a guy, he came as a so-called asylum seeker from Jordan. Despite it apparently being unsafe for him to travel back to the Middle East, that's where he's fled to get away from the consequences of this murder, which is quite something.
Oh, so the only thing you guys need to reverse the traffic from the Middle East to Ireland is if they kill your citizens and are fleeing justice. Then you can get the traffic going the other way. It is odd to make the argument that our response to misogyny should be open borders policies that kill women. Is that ringing in the Irish populace?
Well, I certainly think people are starting to notice these patterns. I mean, like I said, this is a kind of violence that hasn't been seen in Ireland before. And of course, politicians will get up and say, well, it's a male problem, right? It's just male violence against women. But again, we've had so many high-profile cases. When did we ever have people being beheaded in rural Ireland? It was unheard of. There was a high-profile murder of a woman named Aisling Murphy, a teacher who was out for a jog and was just senselessly stabbed to death by a migrant. I mean, these are just stories that were not heard of in Ireland. Again, you had crimes of passion, okay, you had organized crime, but these kinds of senseless, sometimes mass killings, I mean, it's clearly coming from one demographic. And the conversation about it is completely shut off. So, in a sense, it's almost hard to gauge where the population is on this, because any dissent has been shut down. If you want an example
Yeah.
of how insane the enforcement is of language and this kind of thing, for a couple of days, the media couldn't even report the name of this man that it seems very likely killed this woman. And that's because in 2015 they brought in a special act to say that so-called international protection applicants, the asylum seekers, they get a special privilege that they can't be named if they're suspect in a crime. Now, I don't have that privilege, right? If I was suspect in a crime like this, I would be named. But because this man is an asylum seeker, he has a special right to privacy that the Gardaí were putting out a statement trying to gather information on this guy who's actively on the run, fleeing the country. They couldn't even give his name, a photo, anything. You know, this is a guy, oh, well, we believe he's going to the Middle East. We believe he may be connected to this woman in some way. After a couple of days, one of the newspapers here was actually allowed to say his name. But I mean, this is the insanity of it, that these laws are actively, you know, they're aiding this man in committing a crime and fleeing the country.
Well, it seems like there's only two paths for Ireland, either a political resurgence or cultural defeat. Which do you think is more likely?
Well, I mean, you know, I obviously like to stay optimistic about my own country, but certainly there are signs of serious unrest. You know, you can look at the reaction that did happen to that very high-profile stabbing in 2023. You can see that kind of on the ground, especially in more working-class areas, that where you often see this unrest focused. That there is something bubbling up, and you can use those communities as an example because those are the people that are really experiencing the effects of this. You know, if you look at somewhere like inner city Dublin, where Irish people are an overall minority now, so it hasn't yet taken a political form with you know, the middle class in Ireland. There just hasn't been a kind of populist vehicle there. And that is because the establishment here is so uniform. You know, they're so set on stamping out any kind of dissent. And the same thing with this. I mean, another funny little anecdote from this, although it is tragic circumstances, but in the official statement by the Gardaí, or police force, on this murder, one of the main things they said is that they're concerned that far-right figures in the US are going to start discussing this. So
Oh
this
no!
is like
The horror! They must
yeah,
be pearl
yeah.
clutching right now that a far-right figure such as myself would be expressing sympathy for the lost life and maybe just asking questions about why the sense of cultural self-defeat. But we appreciate
I
you
think
coming on to talk about
you
it.
may get more heavily profiled in the Irish media after this than the killer himself, actually, based on the laws here. But yeah, I mean,
It wouldn't be
I
a
think
hate
there's
crime.
only so long you can push through with this insanity. When people see what's happening and you have politicians responding to this saying, no, actually, the real problem is somehow, you know, when an Arab asylum seeker kills an American woman that he was dating in Ireland, that the real problem is Irish people's misogyny. I think that kind of line is only going to function for so long, right? There's a level of ridiculousness that it becomes a little bit easy to poke holes in this.
Well, right. And for the establishment, you have to sort of ask, like, what is it that you're trying to establish or conserve or preserve? The Irish identity is a wonderful one, and I hope it makes it. Keith Woods, thanks so much for joining us, co-founder of Europa.com. He's got a terrific book about how these identity questions ultimately resolve. We appreciate you joining us.
Really appreciate it, Matt. Thank you.